Hey, I just got back from having dinner with a friend of mine that I met through Forgiveness Ministries. We went out and had some sushi and we each had a drink, and there's just nothing like talking about the goodness of the Lord right there in the middle of a restaurant bar, you know. So it was a wonderful, wonderful time hanging out with her, and, you know, with tears in my eyes, talking about some, things from my past. I told her it's like, I love the Lord. And when you see how much he has forgiven you, the depth of love that you have for the Lord is amazing. And when you've been forgiven for much, it's like there's no way I could hold a grudge against anybody. So that is why the Lord wants us to know how much he loves us, because then it gives us the freedom to love others and give mercy and grace to others in our lives, because we have been given a lot of grace and mercy. So that's why knowing the depth of the love of the Father is essential. Because without it, we couldn't extend that love to the people around us. So, okay, so let's start reading. It's February 20th. Purification after childbirth, Leviticus 12, 1 through 8, 1446 or 1279 BC. The Lord said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. If a woman becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son, she will be ceremonial unclean for 7 days, just as she is unclean during her menstrual period. On the 8th day, the boy's foreskin must be circumcised. After waiting 33 days, she will be purified from the bleeding of childbirth. During this time of purification, she must not touch anything that is set apart as holy, and she must not enter the sanctuary until her time of purification is over. If a woman gives birth to a daughter, she will be ceremonial clean for 2 weeks. Doesn't seem fair. What's wrong with the little baby girl?" Okay, I'll just have to keep reading. So, she'll be unclean for 2 weeks, just as she is unclean during her menstrual period. After waiting 66 days, she will be purified from the bleeding of childbirth. When the time of purification is completed for either a son or a daughter, the woman must bring a 1-year-old lamb for a burnt offering and a young pigeon or turtle dove for a purification offering. She must bring her offerings to the priest at the entrance of the tabernacle. The priest will then present them to the Lord to purify her. Then she will be ceremonial clean again after her bleeding at childbirth. These are the instructions for a woman after the birth of a son or a daughter. If a woman cannot afford to bring a lamb, she must bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. One will be for the burnt offering and the other for the purification offering. The priest will sacrifice them to purify her, and she will be ceremonial clean. Nice cup of tea. Contagious skin diseases. Oh boy. Leviticus 13, 1 through 46. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "If anybody has a swelling or a rash or a discolored skin that might develop into a serious skin disease, that person must be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons. The priest will examine the affected area of the skin. If the hair in the affected area has turned white and the problem appears to be more than skin deep, it's called gray hair. Go see your hairdresser." No, I'm just kidding. I'm sorry, guys. I'm sorry for all my jokes all the time when I'm reading to you. If the hair in the affected area has turned white and the problem appears to be more than skin deep, it's a serious skin disease, and the priest who examines it must pronounce the person ceremonial unclean. But if the affected area of the skin is only a white discoloration and does not appear to be more than skin deep, and if the hair on the spot has not turned white, the priest will quarantine the person for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest will make another examination. If he finds the affected area has not changed and the problem is not spread on the skin, the priest will quarantine the person for 7 more days. On the 7th day, the priest will make another examination. If he finds the affected area has faded and is not spread, the priest will pronounce the person ceremonial clean. And it was only a rash. The person's clothing must be washed and the person will be ceremonial clean. But if the rash continues to spread after the person has been examined by the priest and has been pronounced clean, the infected person must return to the examination again. If the priest finds that the rash has spread, he must pronounce the person ceremonial unclean, for it is indeed a skin disease. Anyone who develops a serious skin disease must go to the priest for an examination. If the priest finds a white swelling on the skin and some hair on the spot has turned white, then there is an open sore in the affected area. It is a chronic skin disease, and the priest must pronounce the person ceremonial unclean. In such cases, the person need not be quarantined, for it is obvious that the skin is defiled by the disease. Or y'all have gray hair, and you got to go see the hairdresser. Get your roots done. If you haven't guessed by now, that's what I do. That's my job. Now, suppose the disease has spread all over the person's skin, covering the body from head to foot. When the priest examines the infected person and finds that the disease covers the entire body, he will pronounce the person ceremonial clean. Since the skin is turned completely white, the person is clean. But if any open sores appear, the infected person will be pronounced ceremonial unclean. And the priest must make this pronouncement as soon as he sees an open sore, since open sores indicate the presence of a skin disease. However, if the open sores heal and turn white like the rest of the skin, the person must return to the priest for another examination. If the affected areas have indeed turned white, the priest will then pronounce the person ceremonial clean by declaring, "You are clean." If anybody has a boil on the skin and it started to heal, but a white swelling or a reddish white spot develops in its place, that person must go to the priest to be examined. If the priest examines it and finds it to be more than skin deep, and if the hair in the affected area has turned white, the priest must pronounce the person ceremonial unclean. The boil has become a serious skin disease, but if the priest finds no white hair on the affected area and the problem appears to be no more than skin deep and it's faded, the priest must quarantine the person for 7 days. If during that time the affected area spreads on the skin, the priest must pronounce the person ceremonial unclean because it's a serious skin disease and rather painful, I would imagine. But if the area grows no larger and does not spread, it's merely the scar from the boil, and the priest will pronounce the person ceremonial clean. If anybody has suffered a burn on the skin and the burned area changes color, becoming either reddish white or shiny white, the priest must examine it. If he finds the hair in the affected area has turned white and the problem appears to be more than skin deep, a skin disease has broken out in the burn. The priest then must pronounce the person unclean, for it is clearly a serious skin disease. But if the priest finds no white hair in the affected area and the problem appears to be no more than skin deep and it's faded, the priest must quarantine the affected person for 7 days. Yeah, quarantine should only be for a week, right? The last couple of years, quarantine was a lot longer than that. They should have gone back to the Bible and seen that it only should have been a week, right? Anyways, I'm not going to get off on that subject. On the 7th day, the priest must examine the person again. If the affected area has spread on the skin, the priest must pronounce that person unclean, for it's clearly a serious skin disease. But if the affected area has not changed or spread on the skin and has faded, it's simply a swelling from the burn. The priest will then pronounce the person ceremonial clean, for it's only a scar from the burn. If anyone, either a man or a woman, has a sore on the chin or the head, the priest must examine it. If he finds it's more than skin deep and has a fine yellow hair in it, the priest must pronounce the person ceremonially unclean. It is a scabby sore of the head or the chin. But if the priest examines the scabby sore and finds that it's only skin deep, but there's no black hair on it, he must quarantine the person for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest must examine the sore again. And if he finds that the scabby sore has not spread and there is no yellow hair on it, and it appears to be only skin deep, the person must shave off all hair except the hair on the affected area. The priest must quarantine the person for another 7 days. On the 7th day, he will examine the sore again. If it has not spread and appears to be more than skin deep, the priest will pronounce the person ceremonial clean. The person's clothing must be washed, and if the person will be ceremonial clean, but if the scabby sore begins to spread after the person is pronounced clean, the priest must do another examination, and if he finds that the sore has spread, the priest does not need to look for yellow hair. Ugh, sounds awful. The infected person is ceremonial unclean. But if the color of the scabby sores does not change and the black hair has grown in it, it is healed. The priest will then pronounce the person ceremonial clean. If anyone, either a man or woman, has shiny white patches on the skin, the priest must examine the affected area. If he finds that the shiny patches are only pale white, it is a harmless skin rash, and the person is ceremonially clean. Wow. Sounds intense. If a man loses his hair and his head becomes bald, he is still ceremonial clean. Well, that's good to know. And if he loses hair on his forehead and he simply has a bald forehead, he is still clean. However, if a reddish-white sore appears on the bald area on top of his head or on his forehead, it's a skin disease. The priest must examine him, and if he finds swelling around the reddish-white sore anywhere on the man's head, and it looks like a skin disease, the man is indeed infected with the skin disease and he's unclean. The priest must pronounce him ceremonially unclean because of the sore on his head. Well, pardon me, but what happened to the teenagers? How many teenagers have pimples and, blackheads and zits and everything on? Were they ceremonial unclean? Wow. I hope that people didn't do that to the poor teenagers. Those who suffer from a serious skin disease must tear their clothing and leave their hair uncombed. They must cover their mouth and call out, oh, I can't imagine. Unclean, unclean. As long as the serious skin disease lasts, they will be ceremonial unclean. They must live in isolation in their place outside the camp. Oh, that's terrible. Can you imagine having something like that and being isolated and quarantined and having to yell out unclean? Can you imagine the humiliation and the shame that you would have to go through? That's terrible. Oh my Lord. That's awful. Moving on to Leviticus 13:47 through 59. Treatment of contaminated clothing. Now suppose mildew contaminated some woolen or linen clothing, woolen or linen fabric, the hide of an animal, or anything made of leather. If the contaminated area in the clothing, the animal hide, the fabric, or the leather article has turned greenish or reddish, it is contaminated with mildew and must be shown to the priest. After examining the affected spot, the priest will put the article in quarantine for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest must inspect it again, and if the contaminated area has spread, the clothing or fabric or leather is clearly contaminated by a serious mildew and is ceremonial unclean. The priest must bury the item, the clothing, the woolen or linen fabric, or piece of leather, for it has been contaminated by a serious mildew. It must be completely destroyed by fire. But if the priest examines it and finds that the contaminated area has spread to the clothing, the fabric, or the leather, the priest will order the object to be washed and then quarantined for 7 more days. Then the priest must examine the object again. And if he finds that the contaminated area hasn't changed color after being washed, even if it didn't spread, the object is still defiled. It must be completely burned up, whether the contaminated spot is on the inside or the outside. But if the priest examines it and finds that the contaminated area has failed after being washed, he must cut the spot from the clothing, the fabric, or the leather. And if the spot later reappears on the clothing, the fabric, or the leather article, the mildew is clearly spreading and the contaminated object must be burned up. But if the spot disappears from the clothing, the fabric, or the leather article, after it's been washed, it must be washed again and it will be ceremonial clean. These are the instructions for dealing with mildew that contaminates woolen or linen clothing or fabric or anything made of leather. This is how the priest will determine whether these items are clean or unclean. Cleansing from skin diseases. Leviticus 14:1-32. And the Lord said to Moses, the following instructions are for those seeking ceremonial purification from a skin disease. Those who have been healed must be brought to the priest, who will examine them at a place outside the camp. If the priest finds that someone has been healed from a serious skin disease, he will perform a purification ceremony using 2 live birds that are ceremonial clean, a stick of cedar, some scarlet yarn, and a hyssop branch. The priest will order that 1 bird be slaughtered over a clay pot filled with fresh water. He will take the live bird, the cedar stick, and the scarlet yarn, and the hyssop branch, and dip them into the blood of the bird that was slaughtered over the fresh water. The priest will then sprinkle the blood of the dead bird 7 times on the person being purified of the skin disease. Ugh. When the priest has purified the person, he will release the live bird in the open field to fly away. Oh, good grief. That sounds awful. The persons being purified must then wash their clothes, shave off all their hair, and bathe themselves in water. Then they will be ceremonial clean and may return to the camp. However, they must remain outside their tents for 7 days. Outside their tents, okay? On the 7th day, they must again shave all the hair from their heads, including the hair of the beard and eyebrows. They must also wash their clothes and bathe themselves in water. Then they will be ceremonial clean. My goodness. On the 8th day, each person being purified must bring 2 male lambs and a 1-year-old female lamb, all with no defects, along with a grain offering of 6 quarts of choice flour moistened with olive oil and a cup of olive oil. Then the officiating priest will present that person for purification along with the offerings before the Lord at the entrance of the tabernacle. The priest will take 1 of the male lambs and the olive oil and present them as a guilt offering, lifting them up as a special offering before the Lord. He will then slaughter the male lamb in the sacred area where sin offerings and burnt offerings are slaughtered. As with the sin offering, the guilt offering belongs to the priest. It is a most holy offering. The priest will then take some of the blood of the guilt offering and apply it to the lobe of the right ear, the thumb of the right hand, and the big toe of the right foot of the person being purified. Then the priest will pour some of the olive oil into the palm of his own left hand. He will dip his right finger into the oil in his palm and sprinkle some of it with his finger 7 times before the Lord. The priest will then apply some of the oil in his palm over the blood from the guilt offering that is on the lobe of the right ear. This just sounds... Okay. Through this process of the priest applying the oil in his hand to the head of the person being purified, the priest will purify the person before the Lord. Then the priest must present the sin offering to purify the person who was cured of the skin disease. After that, the priest will slaughter the burnt offering and offer it on the altar along with the grain offering. Through this process, the priest will purify the person who was healed, and the person will be ceremonial clean. But anyone who is too poor and cannot afford these offerings may bring one male lamb for a guilt offering to be lifted up as a special offering for purification. The person who must, I wonder why they have to bring a guilt offering. So people with skin diseases are guilty of something? Or did they believe that they were guilty of some kind of sin, and that's why they have a disease? Interesting. So, back to the person who is too poor and cannot afford these offerings. They can bring a male lamb for a guilt offering and lift it up as a special offering for purification. The person must also bring 2 quarts of choice olive oil choice flour moistened with olive oil for the grain offering and a cup of olive oil. The offering must also include 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, whichever the person can afford. One of the pair must be used for the sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. On the 8th day of the purification ceremony, the person being purified must bring the offerings to the priest in the Lord's presence at the entrance of the tabernacle. The priest will take the lamb for the guilt offering along with the olive oil and lift them up as a special offering to the Lord. Then the priest will slaughter the lamb for the guilt offering. He will take some of its blood and apply it to the lobe of the right ear, the thumb of the right hand, and the big toe of the right foot of the person being purified. The priest will also pour some of the olive oil into the palm of his own left hand. He will dip his right finger into the oil in his palm and sprinkle some of it over the blood from the guilt offering that's on the lobe of the right ear, the thumb of the right hand, and the big toe of the right foot of the person being purified. The priest will apply the oil remaining in his hand to the head of the person being purified. Through this process, the priest will purify the person before the Lord. Then the priest will offer the 2 turtle doves or the 2 young pigeons, whichever the person can afford. One of them is for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering, to be presented along with the grain offering. Through this process, the priest will purify the person before the Lord. These are the instructions for purification for those who have recovered from a serious skin disease, but who cannot afford to bring the offerings normally required for the ceremony of purification. My goodness. That does not sound like anything I'd want to go through. And I've had skin problems. I am so glad none of us have to go through that. Yuck. Well, this was certainly not my favorite Bible reading, but thank you for being with me today. And please come back tomorrow. Hopefully tomorrow will be... Oh, wow. Tomorrow should be interesting. Have a blessed and wonderful evening. And remember, Jesus loves you. He died on the cross, so none of us have to do any of these disgusting procedures to have to become clean. You know, it's amazing what Jesus did on the cross. He freed us from sin, from, the list goes on and on and on. Jesus is amazing. He is the final sacrificial lamb, so none of us have to go find turtle doves or lambs or spotless, animals without defect. All we need to do is just trust in Jesus. Oh, thank you, Lord. Thank you, Jesus. Oh, have a wonderful, blessed night.